Okay, hello everyone. My name is Julian Rodriguez. I'm here in Argentina talking to Peter Bohmer all the way up in California. Peter is a professor of political economy at Evergreen College, and this is our second discussion. Peter, how are you doing today?
Good, good. Actually, I'm in Washington State, north of California. Uh,
Oh, my bad. I always thought Evergreen was in California.
now, I'm
My
in a
bad.
Washington State cap because Evergreen is a very green state. So the nickname for the state's the Evergreen State because it's very green, and that's the name of the college too. So anyway, but it's very hot here. But looking forward to continue from our interview 2 weeks ago.
Oh, I see. Thank you for the correction. I keep updating my U.S. geography. Okay, so we're going to try to cover several topics today, but I would like to start with one that I believe is in everyone's minds. I mean, certainly in the minds of Americans, but also in the of people all over the world, which is that the U.S. is now technically entering a recession. The Fed has increased interest rates now for the second time. They're likely to continue doing that as their preferred way to quell inflation. So this is quite an interesting development, and all the world, I guess, is holding its breath to see what will happen. Um, what I wanted to ask you, Peter, is, well, it's a couple of things.
Yeah.
Number one, the responses to the previous recession back in 2008 was what, well, and also to the dot-com bubble before that, was what we know, if I'm not mistaken, as quantitative easing. Essentially, the Fed pumping a lot of stimulus money that, for the most part, went to Wall Street. For the most part, went to the upper echelons of society, if we can call them that. Um, and essentially lowering interest rates and keeping them really low for a long, long time. The help from the government didn't necessarily come in the style of FDR in the 1930s. Now, coupled with this, we see certain trends over the last 40 or 50 years since the onset of neoliberalism. Essentially, well, we have a significant increase in the cost of healthcare in the United States. We have lower unionization numbers. We have a rising mortgage rates, or rather, rising cost of real estate, um, and wages which have remained relatively stagnant. Now we have this inflation, and the only solution that the Biden administration and Mr. Powell and the Fed have to it is to raise interest rates. And this makes me wonder, could this cure, given all this situation that I've just presented, be worse than the disease? Do you think that the American working class, middle class can take on a recession and rising interest rates?
Okay, so kind of think where to start. So you're right, basically beginning in one of the great recessions. I would call it depression, the one in the early 80s, right? When Paul Volcker was the head of the Federal Reserve, it was a very clear and openly said that we're going to reduce inflation by lowering wages. And it was a period when profits had been somewhat squeezed over the period of the late 60s to the 70s. So I think it was an attempt to restore profits, reduce prices, and reduce wages. Interest rates went to skyrocketing. It led to a situation where unionization further declined. Inflation did decline, and it's true. Inflation, by inflation, I mean the general rise in prices. Okay, the general rise in prices has basically been relatively stable over the last 40 years. So to me, that's positive. But the question is, it's been done at the cost of really kind of stagnant real wages. Wages have been going up the last few years, but I always talk about real wages. Real wages mean the change in wages minus the change in prices. Okay, so for example, in the last year in the United States, say over the, June of 21 to 22, wages have actually risen about 5% on the average, which sounds good, but actually prices have risen about 9%. So mathematically, that means real wages have fallen because you take plus 5 the rising wages, -9, the rising prices. And that difference is more or less what's happened to real wages. So you've had the situation where real wages have been falling in the last year or two and have been pretty stagnant over the last 40 years, while profits have skyrocketed, salaries at the very top have skyrocketed. So you have this growing inequality of income and wealth, probably as high in the United States as it's ever been. And from the kind of first world, the countries in the global north, I don't know how you count Russia. If you count, leaving out Russia for a minute or two, the United States is by far the most unequal of the global capitalist countries. And again, in terms of the issue of dealing with inflation, now you do have a situation where the unemployment rate is relatively low. I'm not sure if I'd call it full employment. A lot of people are still having trouble finding jobs, and a lot of the jobs are very, very low paying, not full time. But you do have a situation of high employment, and that is improving the conditions of workers. Wages going up some, not enough. Also, there have been some growth in unionization, not huge, but there's really stirrings like Starbucks. I was hearing today Trader Joe's, which is a big kind of chain. Workers in Massachusetts, near where I used to live, they voted for union, which is really exciting. So some of that is going on. And so the Federal Reserve, the solution is basically raising interest rates. The idea is by raising interest rates, people will borrow less, let's say, to buy cars, because interest rates will go up with all things, not just the Federal Reserve rate. Housing construction will decline. And I mean, it's pretty open. The Federal Reserve saying that's going to decrease employment, raise unemployment, they hope a little bit, and lower wages. And, what you were saying, the cure being worse than disease, yeah, I don't think inflation is the greatest problem in the world. To me, the question is, what is it in relation to wages, right? If wages were going up more, it wouldn't be so bad, especially these kind of rates of inflation here. I'm not talking about some of the rates Argentina's had, which I think really become these runaway inflation rates. So what could be done? I think, for example, trying to control prices, the price controls over key sectors like food, oil, things that prices have been really skyrocketing, to me would be a much better solution. And so the rise in interest rates, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot in the last week or two. So I'm really worried about the effects in the United States, and I already mentioned that, of higher unemployment. But I think what's not being discussed enough is I see the effects in what I call the global South. Countries that have debts, balance of payments problems, talking about global debt, countries that are, for example, importing more than they're exporting, or paying higher prices now, for example, food or fuel and so on. Basically, they borrow money from these either international lending institutions like the IMF or from private banks. And all those interest rates are going to go up. This is what happened a lot with the whole debt crisis of the early 80s. When countries like Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Poland, Philippines couldn't pay their debt. And in return for that, the IMF said, we'll loan you money, but you have to do what's called austerity, right? Lay people off, privatize, just to make sure the debt's paid. Really kind of neoliberalism, with the threat of saying you're not going to get any loans otherwise. So I think the implications of this rising interest rates are really, really serious for countries like Argentina.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's something. Particularly with the high proportion of debt that we have incurred, dollar denominated debt. Like you mentioned, the '80s was a time of crisis for us, and that ended up in the '90s neoliberal period, where the concession for better terms on that debt is essentially giving away sovereignty, giving away natural resources, giving away our national companies. Many of the state companies of Argentina, which were very big, played a very important role in the economy. In many cases, worked perfectly well, and in some other cases, they were sabotaged from the inside. Because one thing Noam Chomsky points out is that the typical technique of neoliberalism is that you grab a state enterprise, you make it work not well, you destroy it from the inside, and then you point out, hey, look, the state doesn't work. So that was something that was done in my country. and yeah, you opened up that up to private markets. And well, right now, I do have to say, from being an Argentinian, that I am pretty concerned. You have the head of South Command of the United States, Laura Richardson, who gave a speech the other day talking about the importance, the tremendous importance of lithium in Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, and how rich this region is, and how the Chinese and the Russians are a threat. So essentially, giving this Cold War rhetoric, and my country is under a lot of debt from the IMF. And what I fear is that the next administration, in exchange for lighter conditions, will arrive at some sort of deal to give away lithium or other natural resources, which, given the current economic conditions of the world, the war in between Ukraine and Russia, have become very valuable.
One more thing. That's thank you. So I guess in terms of high interest rates to low interest rates, it's true when interest rates are lower, it does make for some financial speculators, putting money in the stock market often goes up because you can make so much money there. But to me, insofar as it creates like wealth in the stock market, I think high income people should be taxed. But in general, to me, a relatively low income policy is generally preferable. And again, I said, like, I just want to stress again, I mean, I think we have to go way beyond price controls to really have an economy. I would call it participatory socialist, where people kind of control the economy, workers, communities, with some kind of participatory planning. I know that's not really on the agenda, but I do think we need to think beyond capitalism. But I think in the movement toward there, trying to have prices controlled, particularly prices that are going up so much, whether it means price controls by the government with a lot of people demanding it, trying to force these companies to making these huge profits, like pharmaceuticals, setting caps or threatening to take them over if they're charging these exorbitant prices. To me, that could go a long way with maintaining a high employment policy.
Yes, well, this is one of the topics I actually wanted to touch on. I mean, there's so many things that I want to say after that. Certainly, one of them is there seems to be, again, like ever since the onset of neoliberalism, a rather small set of options available politically to governments, or that governments are willing to take. When in the past, even conservative administrations such as the Nixon administration instituted price controls. I mean, Nixon instituted a freeze on increases in wages, but also increases in prices to stem inflation. I mean, and FDR during World War II issued a rationing system. Now, these things simply look beyond the pale to certainly the American political establishment, but also the political establishment of much of politics around the world nowadays. And in my view, there's been sort of a retelling of history of, like, for instance, taking FDR and what he was able to do with a New Deal and all that, saying, okay, he was a visionary, and okay, we have to grant, like, he was in many respects. However, there were certain political conditions that allowed for him to take the steps that he took. For example, having a very strong workers' movement at home with the CIO, for example, and abroad. I mean, for better or worse, whether people like it or not, you had this alternate system in the USSR that represented precisely that, an alternate example to workers around the world of what could be done. So these conditions, both at home and abroad, was what permitted an aristocrat, someone who came from the American aristocracy, such as Roosevelt, to implement such revolutionary measures. So how do you, what thoughts come to you when I say this? So in terms of the Overton window of what we're able to discuss as a society, do you believe that we're seeing the conditions with rising unionization to put these sorts of policies on the table once more?
Okay, I don't want to overstress the unionization. To me, there is more and more support among working people for unionization of all the polls, but the actual numbers are incredibly tiny, right? I mean, in terms of the uptick in unionization, it's still only about 6 to 7% of the private sector, more like a third of the public sector. But there is some opening, and I'm also, critical of a lot of unions who so often haven't questioned the kind of business as usual capitalism, where the only hope is getting wages, but doesn't really, really build workers' power. So to me, this idea of Tina, there was really no alternative, to this kind of neoliberal economy, privatization, wages set by the market, obscene wealth, inequality, poverty. It's just, that's the way it is, and a few people can get rich, and that's, what's supposed to keep us going. So we really do need what I call popular education from the bottom up. I'm so influenced by again Paulo Freire, a Brazilian educator who wrote a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, one of my favorite books of all time. I think sharing some of these ideas, are there alternatives, asking people, having it a grassroots way, education, it's not just schooling, that there are alternatives. Yes, the New Deal, I think, had a lot of limits. It didn't include Black people in any kind of just way. It only went so far. It didn't really challenge really the power of corporations, even though they opposed it. But just again, it is really beyond what's being discussed now. So I think there's a lack of imagination, and it's very hard. Things like you're doing, Julian, with alternative media, having people feel that other things are possible, getting together, organizing. The coronavirus, not only to get so many people sick, but it's been hard for people to get together. But if we're going to survive and thrive, whether we talk about climate change, which is so important, the economy, we really need power being built from the bottom up.
I guess this is a great segue to another thing that I wanted to discuss in terms of how does one build power? Because in the United States, what I have observed over the course of my lifetime, I mean, just taking two big examples, like one, the Occupy Wall Street movement as a response to the 2008 crisis. And very recently, the Black Lives Matter movement and the outbursts of popular energy during 2020, which were, I mean, both of these movements were quite impressive, and they allowed us to move the popular debates, let's say, to the left. They allowed for a lot of people to become politically aware and educated. However, at least from what I see, I haven't been able to see neither of these movements translate into a viable political party or option. There seems to be a lot of mobilization, which is wonderful, but as Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, says, he has a wonderful speech about mobilization and organization. And he says that mobilization is great, but you need to translate that into actual organization. And so in the case of the BLM movement, you had this enormous national outburst all throughout the United States. But at least from my perspective, I haven't seen that translated into a mass organization of any kind. So how do you see popular movements actually achieving that?
Okay, so let me talk briefly about both things you mentioned. So the Occupy Wall Street, based, I think, of 2011, and it was really kind of worldwide. We think of what happened in Egypt at that time, in Spain, with the Indignados, in Greece. There was a whole uprising against the austerity of basically the European Central Bank. And the very positive things is, to me, issues of economic inequality, this obscene, I said, income inequality that's really grown since the 70s, really became on the table, even words like capitalism. I heard it a little bit the popular way when there were protests in this area against the World Trade Organization in '99 in Seattle, when there were major protests against one of these international institutions, the World Trade Organization, that was really trying to have a Bill of Rights for capital all over the world. So that consciousness, I mean, that's one step. I don't want to overstate it, but I also think the Sanders campaign, or Bernie Sanders, who I would call a kind of a very decent human being, social democratic, who really wants to challenge some of the things that we're talking about today, and total unbridled corporate power. I don't think you can understand his movement without the Occupy movement. So, see, there was some continuation, even though, to me, the Democratic Party, one of the two big parties in the United States, and very much of a two-party system, I think, like the current president, totally corporate Democrats. but maybe, connected to Sanders, you have people like the Squad, people like Ilhan Omar, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Cory Bush, and others who I think are really decent human beings who really are trying to expand the debate, including some of the stuff we were talking about the government forcing a recession. So it's something that's not enough. We need much more than that. But I guess I was just saying something did develop out of it. So I don't want to be totally negative or cynical either. With the Black Lives Matter movement, really significant. I was in many, many demonstrations and support. And there has been a growth of understanding of like institutional racism. The racism is more than just some people not liking each other and going both ways. So the reaction to it has really grown too, and that's part of the growth of the right. But among a lot of people, Black, Latino, Asian American, Native American, white people, I think an understanding of racism has grown. It's really significant. And institutional racism is still a very, very significant issue in the United States. It hasn't gone away just because you don't have a president like Obama that doesn't deal with 60 Blacks, African Americans make about 60% of the income of whites. They're 3 times, over 40% of people in prison are Black, and they're 13% of the population. So those continue. We do need more like building institutions, building campaigns, what I call building power. And for many reasons we can discuss, I think we need organization that really not just have a leader at the top. We're hoping the Democratic Party can solve our problems. And those are not very strong right now, I think, in most countries of the world. And, there's a lot of individuals, a lot of cynicism, feeling you can't fight City Hall. But I think the problems are great enough, and you see people resisting, and that's going to happen at any time. Even thinking back, I think we thought Argentina, 20 years ago, right? People thought of it as this, Menem is just in control, and there was amazing protests. I think we need organization, we have campaigns, not just demonstrations, campaigns which have clear demands that maybe don't revolutionize society, but really win gains for people and build the power so people continue more. I think that's really what we need. And, probably a political party of a new type that's not mainly electoral, that really has a vision of a different society. It's really rooted in people organizing at the grassroots level, at the workplace, at the community, for dealing with people's needs, but also seeing the limitations within a totally neoliberal capitalist system.
Great, and I wanted to ask you about that. And please, I'm going to give my view of my outside view of what I see in the U.S. political system.
I like to hear that.
Oh yes, thank you. And please correct me. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But I see.
You seem really, really thoughtful about the United States.
Oh, it's been I've always been interested in the United States. I think my earliest memory about it, I guess, was watching Michael Moore documentaries when I was 14 or something like that. I guess that got me interested, and then YouTube and other things. One thing led to another. But yeah, it's a topic of interest to me. So one thing that I'm really interested about is that how there are structural limitations to the political options available to Americans. I mean, and this is given even from the very beginning of the country. I mean, I was reading Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn, Michael Parenti, and others, and they talk about how the founding fathers. I mean, not to mention the obvious fact that many of them were slave holders, and that the big majority of them were aristocrats. You have John Jay saying those who own the wealth of the country ought to govern it. So things like that. But moving to today, I mean, you have this electoral college on the one. So the vote for the president is not direct. The same used to be true for the Senate until 1913 or something like that. And not only do you have the electoral college, but you also have this first past the post system, where whoever wins the state, even by a tiny margin, wins all the electors. Now, this seems to end up trapping the American public between very narrow options. You have these two big parties, and it seems to me that the spectrum of debate, or the overtone window, moves ever farther into the right, because, well, Republicans are obviously supported by the most reactionary forces in the country, and so that is very scary for very natural reasons for a lot of people. But then all Democrats have to do is say, hey, look how horrible the other guy is, vote for me. I know I'm not the best option, but compared to that guy, I'm better. But what I see here is what some people have described as the ratchet effect, whereas a Republican administration will take things to the right, and then all the Democratic administration can do is, at the most, hold things at the same place and maybe just take it a little notch back. But in the end, things are always moving more and more to the right. What uh, is there any possibility of even having a third party in the United States? Do you see that? Do you see reforms such as ranked choice voting, for example, having any viability in the United States, or do you see that there's any option for reform of this system?
Okay, so I might answer a little bit indirectly. So just to add to it, right? So, for example, not only will the Senate is not voted to the constitutional amendment, and I believe it was 13. I'm not sure exact year, but each state has two senators, right? So meaning California, with 40 million people, has the same number of senators. Like the state next to Washington, to my east, is Idaho, a very, very conservative state. A lot of the white supremacists try to make it a center, and it has about 1 million people. So they both have two senators, right? So that's incredibly unequal. So these small rural states have a lot of power. Then in the electoral college, I won't go into all the details, but besides just it all goes to one person, you have the situation where small states count more because each state gets the electoral votes of their representatives, which is somewhat tied to population, the senators, which is so unequal. So it really is a bias toward the smaller states, which also tend to be the more white states. But saying that, and again, this is getting to your question, I mean, the Republicans, who I think are becoming more and more like a authoritarian, right, not a fascist party, and they really are some difference with the Democrats these days, that they're so afraid of the popular vote, but they lost the popular vote in 100% in 2000, right? And maybe in 2004, it's not so clear, but then Bush won the election. They lost the popular vote by about 3 million votes in 16. So one of their strategies is really restricting the popular vote. The Voting Rights Amendments, a very positive amendment, 65, can really undermined, and they haven't been able to change it back to what it was before. So we have this really attempt to restrict votes, particularly among Black people, younger people in general, people who move around. And I mean, it shows that even the system, as limited as it said it was, there's a lot of fear. People could vote. Republicans wouldn't win because, there's so much based kind of on the conservative, not saying all whites are conservative, but the conservative part of the white population, that in the United States, there's going to be a majority of people of color country within the next 20 or 22 years for sure. So rather than broaden and restricting the votes, anyway, I'm just saying that shows, even with the current system, the limits to the Republicans. And the Democrats, you're right, I think it was, people often call it triangulation, going back to the Bill Clinton, very much tied to the kind of big business within the Democratic Party, trying to prevent the Democratic Party that was even, let's say, somewhat progressive. People like Jesse Jackson, or McGovern, who ran for president in 72, and just being a drop to the left of the Republicans. And that's been the strategy. And as the Republican Party moves right, that's been a strategy. To me, a different strategy, even within the two-party system, we get to three, is really trying to reach out to unaffected people. The number of people who don't vote in any of the presidential elections, much like the other ones, are larger than any of the winning parties ever get. It's like something like 40% of the population. So I'm not saying all these people are progressive. They do tend to be poorer, much more likely to be Latino, and so on. So it seems to me really reaching out rather than trying to get the kind of conservative white suburbanites, trying to reach out more toward people who are very alienated. Of course, that means developing programs that could, reach people too. So that's still within the two-party system. It's very, very hard. I think running people, maybe not for president right now, but running people, developing a party that's really tied in movements, that also has an electoral phase, I think is important. It's very difficult because, I think the ranked choice voting, because now often, the less of two evils. And now often, I've been very tempted to vote for the Democrats, even though I see them as so corporate and so imperialist as a party altogether, because they're not as bad as Republicans. I mean, even, whether we're talking about labor, environment, like these people like Biden's been appointing, it really is different from Trump. I mean, it's so conservative, so militaristic, so neoliberal, but there are significant differences, not like the open racism, the open anti-immigrant stuff that the last administration had, but also just so little to do with the kind of really serious problems we're facing, refugees, climate, and so on. So really inadequate, but there are differences too, and that's the dilemma I think a lot of people feel.
Oh no, I see that, and often in discussing this topic with Americans, I mean that's a point that I most often get, is that look, the Democrats are not perfect, and yes, they are a corporate party, and they have all these defects, but they're better than the Republicans. The problem, and I see the same happening in my country, by the way. I mean, and I see it all over the world.
Right.
Is again this shift in the Overton window, where the topics are on the table and what is discussed is based on what the most fringe, well, really not so much fringe, but the most extreme conservative elements will put on the table. So again, it's this sort of discussion that these guys are so crazy. And now after Roe v. Wade was overturned, we even heard Clarence Thomas and other Supreme Court justices saying that other fundamental rights, I think gay rights probably might be on the table of discussion. So that is absolutely crazy to me. So I understand that the fear that would instill in many people, that would make them vote Democrat. However, what I also see in the Democratic Party is that, again, most of what they have to offer is fear of the Republicans. And then when an option appears within the same party, such as Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020, we saw open sabotage of Bernie Sanders' campaign by the same Democratic establishment. I mean, in the I think it was the 2020 election, or maybe it was 2016. No, it was 2016, when Democratic insiders openly admitted that Hillary Clinton was running essentially the Democratic campaign because she was the one that had donated most to the party. And there was some clear instances of sabotage towards Bernie Sanders. So is there even a progressive element that would be allowed within the Democratic Party?
Okay, so, in terms of the difference, I mean, I think, again, maybe that saying the Democrats are not as bad, but they're so much against any idea of kind of human dignity, liberation for all people, particularly we think internationally. But I don't know, I remember, heard this like Noam Chomsky, people asked him, Zinn also, who died about 10, 12 years ago, is, maybe if it's like a presidential thing, let's say, I don't know, Biden versus Trump, in states where they're close, because, each state votes, in Washington, there's no reason to vote for Biden, but in states that are close, you maybe vote for Biden, but then the next day you protest against them, so I'm saying, seeing the limitation, but seeing the difference, but seeing how pro-capitalist, even on the issue of like women's rights, so limited what Biden is doing. He could declare some kind of emergency and really make abortion and reproductive rights through executive order a lot more than he's doing. So it seems to me there, within the Democratic Party, they really did sabotage Sanders. I've had the feeling, and I was thinking recently, there's some exciting things going on in Latin America, by the way, which I follow a lot, like the elections in Colombia, to me, are really exciting. But I remember in the runoff when Hernandez ran against Petro, even though he was so tied to this most right-wing elements, like the worst landowners in Colombia, the whole business class ended up supporting Hernandez against Petro anyway. And I do feel the sadness. A lot of the Democrats probably preferred Trump winning to come down to that, the Sanders. Like when McGovern ran in 72, not just the unions, but almost all the well-off Democrats supported Nixon over McGovern in 72 because he was much more tied to kind of progressive social movements. So I think people trying to make the Democratic Party respond to people, I think that's okay. I don't think that's a long-run strategy, but certainly in certain cities, counties, that can do it. But again, I'm trying to stress more, Julian, the idea of really work not just in electoral arena. It's only one, to me, small part of social change. And I'm critical of people who see the main thing we do is electoral. I think we can build enough power. I know it's a hard thing. We can force a lot of even Democrats to respond more to, like, for example, things like the Green New Deal and so on.
I see. So what would be some of your favorite examples of building power outside of electoral politics that you can think of, like actual examples from the last decades? Any of what are worthy of mention?
So I'm trying to think. I certainly think back in the past, like, the movement against the Vietnam War. You mentioned Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael. I do think this incredible growth of both the civil rights and Black liberation movement created so much power that it moved, to policies that certainly people in power didn't want to do originally. So those would be issues in the past. It hasn't been a period of a lot of victory, but for example, gay marriage, which, I don't think is the be all and end all, but how can you be against it? It did seem like a gay rights movement over maybe more than 10 years, but over, let's say, 25, 30 years, just constantly working, building support, including many things like lobbying, protests, I think really has changed the dialogue. And even though, like, you're right, like Clarence Thomas and his wife, who maybe even worse than him, Ginny Thomas, they are trying to overturn, so that's to be raised. But those, to me, are some real gains.
Wonderful. And
again, when we have movements that make demands in this kind of capitalist, racist, patriarchal system, we never win everything we demand. You always win less. But I do think part of the cynicism, people, feel we can't win. People in power, if you do win like a demand, whether it's, I don't know, raising the minimum wage, which we did in Washington, but not nationally, people in power are never going to say you won because the organizers or the movements. They're going to say it's some other reason. But I think often we can win by basically saying to those in power, the social cost to you by not giving in are going to be even greater than giving in. So building like kind of an offer they can't refuse.
Right, absolutely, and that's something that I fully believe in, and that's actually something that happened here in my country in 2001.
Right.
I mean, after so many years of neoliberalism and unemployment that it was, I believe, in 2001 it was at 17%. You just had terrible social conditions in a country that also wasn't used to them, because again, until the early 80s or maybe a bit before, we were quite a prosperous country. Well, that all led to this huge explosion in 2001, where the president had to essentially flee. We didn't have a White House. We had a pink house, so he had to flee the pink house. That's our presidential palace. But that led that popular explosion, and it really was an explosion, led to the progressive administrations, or create the conditions rather, that allowed for the progressive policies that were taken after that. But you needed that in the first place.
Yeah,
and
and even maybe like Kirchner, was maybe more progressive than he would have been otherwise because of those movements and feeling that pressure from below. And I think another lesson from Argentina, of course, the problem is maintaining the movements, and that's been very hard, but it really included different sectors, from the really the poor and unemployed, more working class, even middle income people. I remember some of the protests I saw at the banks, people couldn't get their money. And I think we need the whole thing here of building multiracial, multi-generational movements that really include working class people, treating working class people with respect, but in a very principled way. Together with saying, more middle income people also can be part of the solution, but they shouldn't lead the movement. They have to be part of it also. So I still do feel possibilities here and basically almost every place in the world. And there is a lot going on now, right? Some of the protests against these IMF austerity programs in Sri Lanka, in Panama, Argentina to some extent too. So I do think people are resisting. I don't know if it's enough, but if we don't resist, definitely those in power stay in power.
Right, and that is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that what you were alluding to about combining struggles is what we would call intersectionality, right?
Right.
So this is something where I fully agree, and I think that people have to organize around their grievances, but that they shouldn't narrow it to their own particular grievance, their own particular problem, but rather combine their struggle with the struggles of others. So, for example, you have today record high student debts. I mean, the student debt in the United States has kept going up. One of the things I was reading about the other day is that something that allowed for there to be such activism in the 60s and 70s, among many other things, obviously, I'm not trying to reduce it to this, was that college education was relatively cheap. Turns out that when you have a ton of debt, you're actually kind of constrained in what you can do with regards to your job. I mean, the same applies to healthcare, right? Healthcare costs have kept going up, and healthcare in the United States is tied to one's job. So that sort of limits the freedom that one has. But then you have other struggles of the even more oppressed and marginalized groups. You mentioned the Black prison population, but I mean, overall prison population in the United States is off the charts. I believe, if I'm correct, you have 4% of the world's population, but 20% of the world's prison population.
Right.
And
that's right.
So how do you think you can make these struggles coalesce? And then if you could say a word or two about the incarceration problem in the United States, I would love to hear about that.
Okay, good. Yeah. So I'm not sure how much I have to add to what you said, Julian. So I think people, because their life experiences, their ideologies, certain issues are going to resonate more, whether it's like this incredible rise in prices in big cities all over the world, housing, and the lack of affordable quality housing. That, from a trip I recently made to many European countries in May to July, the housing issue in every city I visited, except for Vienna, is like just beyond possibly people's income. So, you have a lot of people whom I know 40, 45 years old who are living with their parents because they can't afford their own place. So people are going to pick certain issues, but then to me, it's connecting it to others, right? To connect it to others. And again, to me, capitalism, the system just based on profit, that's destroying the environment, that's creating all these alienating jobs, that seems to me one way of linking it. And I also think there's no shortcuts. So another thing, both in the United States and I noticed in Europe, I don't know if it's a problem in Argentina. It really is a problem in Mexico too, this kind of anti-immigrant, that immigrants are taking our jobs, they're changing our culture. To me, it's so positive having people from all over the world learning from each other, mixing. To me, it makes life worth living. But for example, one way of connecting issues is like saying it isn't what we call with economics a zero-sum game. Because immigrants have jobs, it doesn't mean the native born people lose jobs. People can work together. There's no reason for somebody to have a job, meaning somebody not having a job. Number of jobs isn't fixed. But I think so often people see immigrants as a threat rather than saying we can organize together. So I think one way of doing that is really saying immigrant justice, but also challenging austerity. Because I think a lot of the problems people are having in terms of deindustrialization is basically the anti-union drives, cutting wages. And so the problem, I think, is often the top. But so often people look at people even with less power as the cause, So connecting issues in that way, the principled way, but also respecting people, not thinking of people as stupid or, ignorant that they don't agree, but like respecting people, but then challenging people respectfully and building movements that combine the issues. So I don't know, that's a partial response to what you were saying. I think it's a very difficult problem, but if we're going to survive as a species, I think it's so important to, seeing this commonality. And my favorite word is the word solidarity, where, an injury to one is an injury to all. And people understanding that, I think people can, but I think we have to do it in a respectful way and, listen to people. But I think there are possibilities.
Thank you very much, Peter. And going back, or well, not going back, I wanted to talk about the incarceration problem in the United States. I mean, from what I understand, until the 70s, until Nixon declared the war on drugs, and then later Reagan instituted some further prison reforms, the United States had a pretty standard incarceration rate compared to other industrialized countries. That number has shot up drastically over these last decades, right? Standing on what I was just saying, 4% of the world total population of the United States, 20% of the world prison population, and also just a tremendously corrupt industry. You have Senator Marco Rubio from Florida, who's has lobbyists working with him and obviously giving him lots of money who work for the prison industry. You have crazy regulations such as in Arizona, where private prisons will literally demand that they be filled up to 80% or 100% capacity. This is just looks insane. But so what I wanted to ask you is, what's the real purpose behind such big incarceration problems? Because one thing that Chomsky points out that I found very interesting is that in third world countries, such as in Brazil, or you could say Argentina or other places, the way you deal with the excess population is that just through sheer police brutality, through keeping them in slums, through complete exclusion. In a first world country, industrialized country like the United States, the way you deal with that excess population, and by excess population, I mean population that capital cannot take in, that the capitalistic system in that society, the economy cannot take in, you deal with them by throwing them in prison. So what can you say to that? Does this ring true to you? What's the real cause behind these such big incarceration numbers?
Right. So the United States has almost 2 million people in prison. It actually went over 2 million about 10 years ago, but I think there's a lot of movements about reducing the prison population, sometimes conservatives, because of the high cost of putting people in prison. There's been some reduction, and a bigger reduction because of the coronavirus, of letting some older prisoners out, but it's still almost 2 million. And a country of about 300, a little over 300 million. So it's incredible, the, overrepresentation. I said African Americans, about over 40% of those in prison. There are a lot of white prisoners that a lot of people don't accept a lot, but a lot of Latino, Native American are all much above their numbers in the population. So the U.S. is an outlier, right, from the capitalist Western countries. Again, traveling through Europe, where a lot of the countries have smaller people in prison in the state of Washington, even though the population many times more than where I live, like Sweden, I was, really much, much smaller population, less than half of Washington state with a larger population. So the question is first, why? I think, again, the history of, white supremacy and racism and prison, really growing like after the Civil War, using those people often to labor, either convict labor to work on people's plantations after slavery and or even producing on prison. And in the US, I mean, there's repression against all people who kind of challenge the status quo. Like I've been in prison, some like I mentioned last time, and other threats. But I think particularly toward African Americans, so much the response has been repression, whether it's protest, people breaking the law, very, very quick to lock people up, of just seeing those lives as less valuable than white people, and particularly white, upper class people. So I think there's a history that always existed here, but then really grew in the 70s as a I think in response to a lot of the movements, it really was the thing of criminalizing more of the population, the whole war on drugs, which is really significant. And in terms of, again, African Americans, like Michelle Alexander in the book New Jim Crow, showing people African American around drugs more likely to be arrested compared to a white person, more likely to be charged with a more serious crime, more likely to be convicted, more likely to get a longer sentence, less likely to get out, and so on. So those add up to this really disproportionate amounts. And there are some really strong movements around prison reform, decrease the population, which has had some effect. But the situation is, it's incredibly unjust. And even just thinking, today, like you see, I'm sweating. It's this really heat wave. And I was thinking, it's bad enough, here, but think of people in prison, how severe it is. So there is, I think, some movements like basically in Washington, again, where I live, it's kind of a more progressive state than some, that people around possession of drugs are really not going to prison anymore, except for maybe in really rare circumstances. So that is a significant improvement. But yeah, to me, 2 million people being locked up in cages is, unpardonable. In terms of the private public stuff, the thing you said about Ruby, okay, so I think it's a myth about I'm leaving aside the immigration stuff I'll get to in a minute, but the regular prisons are so-called criminal. Of course, what's a crime? Somebody who, basically charges $2,000 for one-room apartment. That's not considered a crime. That's considered good business, while shoplifting is considered a crime, right? Even if you're very poor, you don't have enough food. But the regular prisons, the non-immigrant ones, are over 95% public. And so they're not private. So that's a myth that it's private prisons. But even there, like I know in California, while I was in prison, really sad that, the prisoners' guards who make a lot of money, the correctional officers, California correctional officers, they've been in the forefront for pushing for more prisons, for 3 strikes and you're out. People have 3 convictions, even if the third one's not very big, going to prison for life. In Washington for 25 years. So laws like this have really been pushed by the prison guard. So it is true that people who benefit by it, like again, in Washington, the phone calls, even the email, not emails, prisons don't have internet, but writing to people is all privatized. So there's a lot of profit being made, and it's a very, very big business. But to me, it's more than the business in terms of this growth, but that certainly is part of it. On the other hand, the immigration prisons, they're overwhelmingly private. Like Geo Corporation, Correctional Corporation of America, they're making money. And I think some of the things you were talking about, of pushing to fill the beds, that is mainly around the immigration prisons, which are not called prisons, but if you try to escape from there, you'll be shot. So there's one right near us called Northwest Detention Center, 30 or 40 kilometers away north of Olympia. People just locked up there. There's a suit now because they were getting, if you work, you're getting paid $1 a day, for working all day at the prison too. And really bad conditions. Those are private prisons. So I do think any movement, I guess one more thing I'll say, there are also political prisons in the United States. The government, of course, denies. I think all of our movements, supporting prisoners, working with prisoners, pushing for people getting out, supporting our political prisoners is really important to every movement that we're part of.
Right. Could you mention some of them? Some the ones that come to mind right now are Mumia Abu Jamal, on the one hand, who has been in prison since the 80s, supposedly for shooting a cop, but that's really thrown into question. I personally don't believe that was the case. Then you have Leonard Peltier, right, of the American Indian movement. Can you speak to me a bit about these cases? Have you been active?
So briefly, Mumia Abu Jamal is amazing, kind of just a really great thinker, writer, journalist. He had been the youngest member of the Black Panther Party and then became a radio journalist. And I believe it was 80. His brother was being beaten up. He was driving a cab, and a shootout developed, and he was shot, and the cop Faulkner was killed. I don't know whether he did or not. There's no way it could have been first-degree murder. But I think what's clear was that the evidence against him was totally cooked. There was so many people who later recanted their testimony, and so in a sense, there wasn't evidence to find him guilty, and there've been so many, kind of irregularities in the trial. Because of pressure from below of movements, he originally had a death penalty, and it got changed to life without parole, and that's being challenged now. But he's had a lot of health issues, but he's been now for 40 years, over 40 years, and he still writes lots of amazing music conditions. He's written some really amazing books, and just really, I think, thoughtful person. Leonard Peltier was the leader of the American Indian movement, and basically Native Americans have been colonized, and you were talking about the American Constitution earlier. I mean, part of what the U.S. did when they became independent from England was increasingly taking land from Native people, taking their land, and so on. So to me, that's very much part of this reason we shouldn't romanticize the whole founding of the United States. Anyway, Peltier was a leader of the American Indian movement. There'd been a huge massacre in Wounded Knee in the 19th century, and there was a big movement challenging some of the taking of the raw materials from Pine Ridge Reservation, South Dakota, in the 70s. And what happened was the FBI came on the land, and some of the American Indian movement, kind of a leading movement about self-determination for Native people. There are about 2 million Native people in the United States. And he was eventually, they said he was involved in the shooting of these 2 FBI agents. And again, he went to Canada, but he was caught. And again, the other people with him who were charged, they got acquitted. And again, the evidence is so weak against him. And he's been in now like 40, 45 years. Again, really bad health. I'm just worried if he's going to die very soon in prison. And there were a lot of hopes that Obama would commute a sentence, but the FBI has been so much against it, hasn't happened yet. Again, it's just a really, I think, stand-up human being. There are many others going back to cases from the 60s and 70s, but those are the 2 most well-known. And there are movements around both of them to have them freed. So people are organized. I've spoken probably at 10 protests around Leonard Peltier's case.
Wonderful. Peter, there's so much more I would like to discuss today, but I'm aware that you have a meeting soon, and also I can see you're suffering from quite a heat wave up in Washington. So, but if I understand correctly, we're going to have another discussion pretty soon. So any topics that are still on the table, we'll have time for that perhaps next week. Is there anything else you would like to mention on this occasion?
Let me think a second. We didn't really talk much about the issue of like income inequality in the United States and wealth inequality. It's just continued to grow, and again, to me, there's a lot of awareness. So I guess maybe I'll say this: it's very easy, to be very, very cynical right now, because for a series of reasons, including internal problems of the left, I think movements and the left is very weak in most countries. I'm leaving Latin America out. I think it's somewhat more hopeful. But, whether it's the Black Lives Matter, the conscience about racism, or even from the coronavirus, the view that everybody should have health insurance in the United States, and it shouldn't go through insurance companies, but should be done by the government or locally. Support for that has really, really grown, or that the kind of jobs, whether it's like people working in hospitals, service jobs that have been very vulnerable to coronavirus, that people should have decent wages, being treated with respect, that wages shouldn't just be determined by the power of capital to set the lowest wages possible. All those seem as really possible. And we can never predict when there'll be an explosion of movements. Again, the climate change, I'm so dire the issues in this heat wave right now that you see me suffering, and going on all over the world, people dying from excess heat, like in Europe, and the growth of forest fires. My son just came back to California. I'm going to meet him in a few minutes. These huge forest fires, out of control. I do think awareness is not enough, but I do think something is happening that could explode. So that gives me some hope. And I just see, there's no alternative than trying to create a better society. If you don't do it, we know those in power win, and, we're all really vulnerable. So maybe I'll close with some, a little bit of optimism.
That's wonderful, Peter. And we can discuss income inequality more in our next talk. I've read some of your writings on the matter, so I would very much like to discuss that. But for today,
one more, maybe next time, about what kind of society I see. What would be an alternative?
Excellent. Yes, absolutely. We can always we can get quite pessimistic if we just focus on the bad things about the present, but it's always good to end on a note of where can we move forward. So yeah, I will very much like to discuss that with you, Peter. So thank you very much for spending this time with me today, and I look forward to our next talk.